Hello, AP Environmental Science students. Mr. Harrison here. Going to be talking about three different topics here today. But before we get started, I was recently asked in one of my Zoom sessions with other teachers if I could go anywhere in the United States or in the world. Where would I want to go and show pictures? And I immediately thought of the Galapagos Islands. I think the Galapagos would be a really cool place to go to see biodiversity, to see evolution. Um, it has things like these marine iguanas, which are really unusual, that go down and eat kelp and algae off rocks. It has a variety of different finches, giant tortoises, constantly dealing with volcanic activity, disturbances that are occurring there. And these species are adapting because they're acquiring different range of tolerance. So this would be the place I would want to go. It's off the coast of Ecuador, and it has to do with the things we're going to be learning today. So today our purpose board is to examine FRQ questions. So we're going to be continue to work on our skills related to 2.3, which has to do with the theory of island biogeography, 2.4, ecological tolerance, and 2.5, natural disruptions. How we're going to do this is through lecture, of course, and I have a couple free response questions embedded in this ed puzzle. And we're basically breaking down biology, biodiversity, and some of the factors that influence them. We know that as a principle of sustainability, and we also know we need to develop our FRQ skills. So 2.3, theory of island bio, word biology, of course, living thing, geo having to do with the earth, and graphy having to do with maps. So thinking about living things on places, mainly islands, when we talk about island biogeography. So our learning target is to describe what island biogeography is. We're going to be working on our skill of concept explanation again. And you can see our essential knowledge. We're going to be talking about what this is, this island biogeography. We're going to talk about how it affects things like evolution. And down here you can see really important is how does this influence biodiversity, and what happens to places like islands when there's a significant disturbance or something like an invasive species. Um, because islands oftentimes evolve species that are pretty sensitive to disturbances. They're specialist species, not very easily adapting to changes in conditions. And when we talk about biodiversity loss, oftentimes we're talking about places like Hawaii or the Galapagos in some cases, where species are being lost. And also, we're going to learn that islands aren't always specifically islands out in the ocean, and they can be isolated habitats. Okay, so what is this? The study of ecological relationships and community structures on islands. So again, they could be actual islands out in the ocean, or they can include places like Central Park. Pretty cool place if you've never been. Um, it's an island of forest surrounded by New York City, where some species remain in that area and only that area their whole life and for many generations, because they are adapted only to that forest ecosystem, not this urban ecosystem. So the two basic rules, things to remember, it's pretty straightforward, is that larger islands support more total biodiversity. So areas that are islands, either physically, again, islands out in the ocean, or islands that are surrounded by disturbance, they're going to have more diversity. That's because there's more food and more habitat resources and niche or roles the organisms can play within that ecosystem. Islands closer to the mainland support more species. That's the second thing. So large islands and ones closer to the mainland. That's because it's easier for species to colonize from the mainland. And more colonizing organisms equals more genetic diversity. Remember back to we talked about biodiversity, and one of the aspects is genetic diversity. So they're going to get more individuals getting to those islands and adding to the gene pool. You can kind of see a graph and a map together, and each of these bars representing the number of species. We're going to be talking about this here a little later. So higher diversity with larger larger islands, more available niches or niches. An example would be the Galapagos. In the Galapagos, there are many different zones because there's some topography. It's mainly volcanic, and it creates these areas where the climate or the vegetation is distinct, and the resources available for things like birds. So different food sources create diversity of, in this case, birds. A larger population size, again, means more genetic diversity and more resistance to disturbance because there's more diversity. Genetically, they can have more variation in their traits, and say there's a disease or a disturbance, there might be unique traits that allow that species to survive. Lower extinction rates. All right. So it is pretty much a linear relationship that the number of species is directly related to the size of an island. And this is the island size in square kilometers. These are Caribbean islands. And you can see the largest one is Cuba, and it has the most number of species. Rodana, being the smallest, has the least amount of species. All right, so this is somewhat redundant, but larger island, the closer island as well has a higher species richness, and that's because species are able to migrate there easily. They could either fly or swim. In some cases, animals make it on these vegetative rafts. Things like lizards might end up on a chunk of vegetation, a floating vegetation, and actually blown to an island or washed to an island in the ocean. Frequent migration brings more genetic diversity and larger populations. So here we have a diagram that shows with different shapes and colors, different species. You can see a great diversity here on the mainland. And this island that's closer is going to have more probability of getting all those individuals over to this island. And then what happens, we're going to be talking about evolution. So we can have isolation of those populations, and they can change over time, both genetically and physically, and become different species than the mainland. You can see way over here, island C being the furthest away is least likely to get all the diversity. It's only going to have one individual species make it. Okay. I think that's pretty much covered it. I'm going to skip that. So evolution on islands, there's limited space and resources which create unique conditions for evolution. So islands tend to have higher speciations occur rapidly because those conditions are limited and species are isolated, and they can mutate differences, and there's more pressures for them to adapt. So this term adaptive radiation in evolution means when a species, single species rapidly evolves into several new species using different resources and reducing competition, that resource partitioning we've talked about. Classic example is Galapagos finches. Different beaks quickly evolved to fit a variety of different types of foods on the islands. So here's an example. And they know from both genetics and from looking at physical traits that this is what the phylogenetic tree looks like of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Had a common ancestor somewhere in Ecuador, made it to the islands, and in the span of a few million years, radiated into all the variety of different species you can find in on those islands. Charles Darwin was pretty amazed. He didn't know this actually. He collected all these samples and he thought they were all different species, or sorry, all very different birds. And it wasn't until another scientist was able to look closely to recognize they were all finches, in fact, and probably eventually helping to spawn his ideas on evolution. So, adaptive radiation. All right. So here's the common ancestor, and you can see the food sources. Those food sources are going to again vary depending on where you are on the island. And that's going to isolate those populations as they start to evolve different unique characteristics.